not care that we are perishing? It was the cry of disciples in a storm-tossed boat on the Sea of Galilee. It was the cry of people at the edge of despair, the cry of those trapped in darkness and chaos and afraid for their lives. Do you not care that we are perishing? Maybe there's been a time when that's been your cry as well. Don't you care? God, don't you care that I'm frightened, overwhelmed, grieving, in pain? Why don't you answer? Why don't you do something? Why is this happening? It's such a natural question when things go wrong. And it's such a hard question to answer. We so desperately want life to make sense, to be fair. We want to feel in control. But sometimes we just aren't. A few weeks ago, the NPR show This American Life aired a series of stories about grief. A man named Rob told about the death of his young son. He spoke of unimaginable pain and of how the words of those who tried to comfort him so often seemed empty. He needed to live through the misery before he could even think about coming out the other side. And that made those around him uncomfortable. He said that 3 years later, he still found it hard to believe that it was real. A man named Sean told of a series of losses in quick succession: the death of 2 parents and the end of a long relationship. The sorrows piled up so quickly that he couldn't properly grieve for any of them. He just shut down. And the final story was about a woman named Leah who died from COVID-19. Before she died, she wrote her own obituary, and they read it on the air. She wrote, "I departed from my temporary home on March 12, 2021, surrounded by my family. I am waiting for Christ's return. I was 33 and 1/2 years young." There were other stories, but those are enough to get the idea. So much suffering, so much loss, so few answers. I used to think that the book of Job was a fable, but is his story really that much different from these true stories from the current day? Job was wealthy, successful, and faithful to God, at least until the day when everything fell apart. In one day, his 10 children died and his property was destroyed. Soon thereafter, he was inflicted with painful sores that covered his whole body. And everyone wanted to understand why. You see, there was an idea way back then that if you were good and faithful and generous, then God would take care of you. Good things would come to good people, and bad things to bad people. It was an idea way back then, and it's an idea I hear way too often still today. It might not seem too harmful to think that good things will come to good people, but when you take the idea to its logical conclusion, it turns to poison. Because if good things come to good people, then if bad things come to you, well, that must mean that you deserve them. And that's what Job's friends concluded. They said they were there to comfort him, but mostly they tried to convince him that he must have done something to deserve all the terrible things that had befallen him. You may have heard someone described as patient as Job. You ever heard that? As patient as Job? Whoever came up with that phrase didn't read the whole book. Job is patient in chapter 2. Then he starts to complain, and he complains, and he complains, and he complains, at least whenever he can get a word in edgewise with his visitors. He complains for 35 chapters. Job and his friends go back and forth on the whys and wherefores of suffering. They don't get very far. This goes on until finally God appears. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. But God's answer to Job's complaint isn't itself all that helpful. It almost sounds sarcastic. Where were you, God asks? Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. How could Job possibly understand the mind of God? The implication is clear. How could we? On the other hand, God does show up, and God's presence makes a difference. In a passage after the one we read today, Job replies to God. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, he says. I had heard of you, but now my eye sees you. Job sees God and has nothing more to say. The mystery of evil and pain will just have to be. It's not so important in the presence of God, before the face of God. Maybe you've had an experience like this yourself. Maybe it wasn't a good time. It might have even been the worst of times. But it was a time when you felt God's love, God's presence. And as it was for Job, maybe that was enough. Let's go back to the boat on the Sea of Galilee for a moment, on that night when Jesus slept through a storm. But first, a quick aside. I've talked a lot this morning about some of the worst moments of our lives. It's all very cheerful, I know. But I do want to mention one slightly more lighthearted and very practical lesson we can draw from today's gospel. That lesson is this. Even when storms rage, it's okay to take a nap. After all, Jesus did. It's good sometimes to follow his example, in this as in other things. Don't be afraid, have faith, and get some sleep. Okay, but back to the terrified disciples who were most definitely not napping. Back to their cry. Do you not care that we are perishing? We all know what happens next. Jesus calms the storm, saving his friends, but also terrifying them even further. The miracle is important, I suppose. It demonstrates Jesus' power, his identity, his faith. But for me, the comfort in this story isn't in the miracle. It's in Jesus' presence, even while the storm continues, even while he still sleeps. Even when there are no answers, even when storms rage, Jesus is there, maybe taking a nap, unworried, present, and yes, caring. I sometimes think of this scene as I fall asleep at night. I imagine myself on a boat with Jesus sleeping nearby. And I know that even if a storm comes, all is well. Look up at the ceiling for a moment. It takes the form of the keel of a boat. And that's no accident. It's traditional in church architecture. We're all inside that boat. We're all secure in God's presence. We may not always have smooth sailing, but we never have to face the storm alone.